you're like freaking out about, am I gonna like, is it gonna destroy the world? Is this, am I gonna die? Am my family gonna be okay?
Yeah.
Like, this is unbelievably stressful. So us, CODEPINK trying to start this conversation is also meant to create a space where people don't feel alone, right? Like, obviously, we're all hella stressed out about this.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, like, I just want you all to know that we are here for you, and we care, and you're not the only one who feels stressed out about this. So yeah, the agenda is basically we're gonna cover some context about Chinese Americans, high-level geopolitical discourse, how that affects Chinese Americans' lives, like on the ground and our daily life, and what we should do moving forward. Slide please. So you probably are all aware, but trigger warning for anyone because there will be upsetting topics being discussed here. Pace yourself if something is too upsetting. But we're here for you if it is too upsetting, and don't feel like you have to do all of this all at once. Slide please. Cool. So Chinese Americans. We've been here since the 1800s, since like the early mid 1800s when we came over through the gold rush. And the Chinese Americans, we have a long history not only in California but also in other parts of the country, such as like Boston trading, opium in China in the 1800s. And so there have been many ways of Chinese immigration over time, and maybe for a show of hands, like who here identifies as first-gen immigrants if you're Chinese American? Okay, first-gen, second-gen? Okay, third-gen? Fourth-gen? Okay, so mostly first and second gens. I identify as 1.5 gen. I was born in China and I moved here in 1999 with my family. So we're kind of newbies, but yeah, there's definitely been a very long history of Chinese Americans. Next slide. And so the way that I think about the Chinese American diaspora is one of a migrant workforce. And so when you think migrant workforce, like usually sometimes you don't really think that Asians or Chinese Americans are migrant workforces. Like I think migrant workforces, I think, are a label that are commonly maybe given to like Latino communities or like even Eastern European communities. But the reality is the Chinese American diaspora is and always has been a migrant workforce. We come here for economic opportunity, and we are not really meant to assimilate to this country. And there have been laws and reasons that have tried to control how much the Chinese American diaspora assimilates into America. And so in recent eras, we saw a huge jump in Chinese American immigration after 1965 immigration reform, where that opened the doors to Chinese Americans with specialized degrees to migrate into America. So before the reform, there were smaller populations from the railroad era, from the gold rush era, but there wasn't much immigration before that because of the Chinese Exclusion Act. But America strategically selected for specially trained Chinese Americans to start immigrating to America as a migrant workforce to work in like science and technology industries. So if we look at these charts, we can see that in the middle, the blue bar graph represents the percentage of Chinese people who immigrate based on employment-based preferences, and we can see that we are overrepresented for employment-based preference immigration. And so So yeah. So the Chinese American, one of the American work. So next about a little bit about here or the gold rush. And so we're intended to return home in the year than in China. And many Chinese contracted labor who worked in like mining and agriculture, and they were paid significant by laborers. They were favorable, which led to widespread business, they operate humble businesses, or they're not really part of that like academia PhD crowd that's like middle class Chinese people are in. And a lot of these families are like multi-generational. They've been here for a long time, third, fourth generation. They have grandparents who were here in like the early 1900s or 1800s. So there's definitely not a uniform post-1965 reform are in this camp. Next slide. So here's just some data backing up what I'm saying about this middle and upward striving Chinese American identity class. You can see here, this is a distribution of the ethnicity of employees at Facebook. And we can see that in 2022, there are 46.5% of employees at Facebook are Asian versus 37%, which is crazy considering Asians only make like what, or Chinese people or only make up like a single-digit percentage of the population, right? So clearly there's some like over selection for certain kinds of careers. You can see in the racial dynamic, the racial breakdown of the student body at the UCs, at Irvine, at Berkeley, at UCLA, like there are high Asian and Chinese populations at those schools. And when we then look at the relative representation racially for different kinds of majors, we can see that, you know, Asians, despite only making up 5–10% of the population, they make up somehow 33% of all computer engineering workers. Right. So all of this data is really no secret. Like we all know that like the middle and upper middle class Chinese Americans tend to, want to have class mobility and they want material security. And so there's this kind of pattern of Chinese American families fostering their kids to enter into elite STEM programs or good high schools in order to get into these elite universities and then eventually get into like a nice prestigious company like Google or Facebook or Raytheon or whatever, right? So next slide. And so this is what they want. This is what the Chinese Americans want, right? Like our families come over here for a better life and they want, I think like what we want is like pretty humble. Like we want just a middle class home. We want like car too. We want to be able to have the stability to go to Branch 99, go get boba, play League of Legends, and just do our job, right? Like this is, and like maybe go to a rave and every once in a while. Like I know there's a huge rave culture in Southern California and the Bay Area in general, and I know Chinese people and Asians love going to these things. And on the surface level, this all looks good, right? Like this looks great. This is what our families wanted. Left this country, we left China, our motherland, in order to have this, to achieve this American dream. Next slide. So what's the problem? What's the problem? Like why, if this all looks good, what's the issue, right? So yeah, next slide. Basically, I think for a lot of Chinese Americans, when our families immigrated here, especially if you're like post-1965 reform, China and America had this golden era of relations where the economic relationship between China and America was not adversarial. It was still kind of, obviously there was exploitation, right? Like everything's made in China, like that's probably not super cool, but when they came, it was a different time. But in 2023, the geopolitical situation between China and America has radically changed since the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s, the 2010s. And so here's like a list of just some of the things that are issues that are coming up because of this geopolitical tension. There is a labeling that the United States and the West is in a new Cold War with China because the Chinese have a state-controlled socialist government and economy. The COVID situation really exacerbated relations. The proxy war in Ukraine is essentially a proxy war between the US and China. Taiwan is also a very sensitive issue, and the reason for that is because Taiwan, creates technologies like they have TSMC, and they have a lot of sensitive. Taiwan offers a lot of competitive technologies that both China and the West and the United States are competing over. So besides microchips, other sensitive technologies that China and the United States are racing against each other for include AI, electric vehicles, networking technology, biotech technology, autonomous cars, and just all of this like scientific intellectual property that both countries are competing against for like civilizational development. There is tension between the Chinese yuan and the United States dollar, and the Chinese yuan might possibly be challenging the US dollar as a reserve currency as countries in the Middle East start settling their oil trading in yuan instead of dollars, which seriously threatens American well-being and hegemony. And there's talk about decoupling, right? Like everyone's talking about, oh, we got to like move all of our factories out of China. We can't like rely on them anymore. And so that's also like the whole trade war that Trump was trying to fight with China was over decoupling. So yeah, there's like a lot going on, right? Like this wasn't happening 20 years ago when our parents came here and they like bought a house and everything was like chill. So the geopolitical landscape has changed a lot. Next slide. And so obviously a lot of this tension was because of China's rise and China's economic rise. And that's definitely unavoidable. And I think for a lot of Chinese Americans, the assumption in the immigrants' thinking was that China would not catch up to the United States, or China would not catch up to the United States fast enough where it would be a problem in our or our children's lifetimes. But clearly that assumption was not true, right? It's one thing if this happened in 2050, 2023, but it's happening in 2023 now. And so clearly there's some miscalculation of whether or not immigration is the true cause of immigration. And so I'm sure most people in this room are aware, but one thing that really attracted our families to come to the United States was economic opportunity and political freedom and liberal democracy and all these things about human rights. But if we're going to be upfront about it, the American empire and Anglo-America in general has always used violence and force and economic sanctions and racism to maintain its rule. It is not clean cut where it's just, oh, we just have better morals. There is real military and economic force that is used to enforce hegemony. We saw this. And so this map, covers what's been going on for the past couple of centuries, right? That they don't teach us in school, right? When, as Chinese Americans, rarely do we ever cover in depth, like the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Iraq War, the Afghanistan War. I mean, hell, many of us were children when the Iraq War was happening, right? I remember when I was 8 years old. No, I was 6 years old when 9/11 happened, and the next thing you know, I knew we were going to war with Iraq. But how was I supposed to know what the meaning of that was, right? So something that we, as Chinese Americans, should really just get out of the way is freedom is really not free, and it's obviously not equitable to everyone on the planet. And the American dream that our parents had have moral costs. Next slide. So in recent memory, we all remember what's been going on in the Middle East, right? With the United States intervention in Iraq, with millions of civilians dead, providing military support and drones and weapons to Saudi Arabia, which worsened the Yemeni, civil war, which luckily China has recently negotiated a peace treaty for, which is amazing, right? And the trillions of dollars spent in Afghanistan that, who knows why we were there, but who knows how much money that cost. And so, the American foreign policy is very aggressive in ensuring that, America's foreign policy goals are achieved to secure access to oils, to secure access to metals that, eventually get shipped to our gas station when we put in our car. So there's this concept called autarky, which in international relations refers to self-sufficiency. And I think a lot of Chinese Americans assume that the United States is an autarkic country, but the reality is it's not as clean cut as that. There are real adversarial relations that happen for the United States to ensure its standard of living for its citizens. Next slide. So who here is familiar with the military industrial complex? Okay, basically everyone. So, so I won't go too much into it, but basically the way Chinese Americans play into the military industrial complex is really in this part of the triangle here, right? when the Pentagon funds or gives like weapons manufacturers contracts, that's with tax dollars. Those tax dollars come from citizens. And so when you have this very large migrant labor workforce that, has relatively high household incomes, we are paying a lot of income taxes to the federal government, and that money is going towards weapons. That money is going towards warships, radars, jets that are now being used to monitor the South China Sea, right? That's paying for all the propagandists who write that, that's paying for all the propagandists that the defense companies hire to write anti-China pieces in the media to manufacture consent for war. And not only that, the problem is twofold because so many Chinese Americans work in STEM itself. And so a lot of Chinese Americans, when they work on, research papers in technology or AI or math or physics or medicine, that is all power that can be used to advance American hegemony and foreign policy goals. And so it's really twofold. Next slide. Does everyone know what manufacturing consent is? Okay, so clearly manufacturing, like America has somehow manufactured consent amongst the Chinese American community to basically support war. But now, I think a lot of Chinese Americans kind of ignored it when it was against the Middle East or, Africa or, Eastern Europe. But now what happens when it's our own country? What happens now when they're trying to manufacture consent for us to go to war against China, a country where many of us have family? Okay, like who here is Chinese American has family in China? So I don't know about you, but it makes me feel horrible that I support a regime that potentially wants to go to war with my grandparents, with my cousins, with, my uncles and aunts, and like my parents. No amount of economic opportunity should justify that. None. None. That is not what life is about, right? So, next slide. And as we can see here, the US is chugging right along with providing military aid to Taiwan. And every single time they do that, like the shareholders get excited and shares for Lockheed Martin and Northrop Grumman go up. And to them, it's just one big, bag of cash to grab and, not real human lives as we know, right? So, next slide. And so I think one takeaway as Chinese Americans is we need to understand that the relationship that the United States has with China has become adversarial. Okay, it is not the golden era anymore where China and America are just harmonious and friends. It has become an existential threat, and China knows this. And we can see this through the sanctions that China is now placing onto American companies, rightfully so, in my opinion. But imagine, you grew up in America and you didn't really think about all this political, these politically sensitive issues. For example, I know many Chinese Americans who work at Raytheon, who work at Lockheed Martin, and they have been trained to do so since childhood, right? Like these good intentions that a lot of our Chinese American parents had in terms of, wanting us to have good, stable STEM careers has turned into wartime collaborationism. That's insane. That is absolutely insane. And I know people who are Chinese Americans, my age, our age, who work for these companies, and now with these sanctions, I don't think they're going to be able to go back to China. And this is something that every single Chinese American should be thinking about when they take a job at these kinds of companies. Don't just look at the money, you need to look at like the political ramifications. Next slide. Okay. So we transition a little bit. We just talked a lot about, Washington, about these big companies, about corporations, all these like high level things. But how is this going to affect our daily life as Chinese Americans on the ground? And so clearly, as competition with China gets more intense, there will be more scrutiny against Chinese Americans in terms of entering industries with sensitive technologies, whether that's research labs or companies that require defense clearance, or even working at big corporations that work on advanced technology. It seems like every single year there's at least a couple news stories where it's like Chinese employee at Apple steals self-driving car IP, or Chinese professor gets fined and jailed under the China program for collaborating with the CPC. So the scrutiny has been happening for a couple of years now, but I think as the tension gets worse, so will the scrutiny and so will the xenophobia. There is a chance that if you are Chinese American and you work in sensitive technology, you will not be able to leave, or at least you will not be able to go back to China. Okay, like the United States. So when Qian Xuesen, who was one of the first nuclear scientists who was Chinese who worked on the Manhattan Project, when he tried to go back to China, they would not let him leave. They put him under house arrest for 5 years. So these types of, I think for a lot of Chinese Americans, like we need to be careful about what we put our effort and energy towards. Like, don't just think of it of like a paycheck or, oh, we're just doing science. We need to think about like the social sensitivities and political sensitivities. There could be greater political persecution. We could be scapegoated by some political party. Judy Chu recently talked about this, because especially in the upcoming 2024 elections, if a candidate decides that they want to build their platform off of anti-China policies, that's going to be hell. That's literally going to be Red Scare round 2. Okay, Red Scare round 2, where all of a sudden every Chinese person is now a spy, even though some of us were just kids when we were brought here, and none of us chose to be here, and we just wanted a little bit of material stability, but it's turned into that kind of nightmare. And we saw this during COVID, right? We saw the hate crimes, we saw the surge in elders being attacked. It was crazy for a virus that had nothing to do with us, just because we were Chinese or Asian looking. And so you want to add on geopolitical tension and potential that we are spies onto that, it's going to be horrible. So yeah, I mean, I think the last thing I want to say is there's also chance of like financial danger, especially if the Chinese yuan starts challenging the value of the US dollar at a global level. Like if your savings are all valued in US dollars, or if all of your assets are priced in US dollars and the US dollar starts losing value because of the yen or some other currency, then that's a big fiscal risk. So here are just some of the headlines that some of you have probably seen over the past couple of years. Top left is a Chinese American professor who was falsely accused for spying for China, and there have been multiple professors like this. It's been happening all over the country, and the legal fees are incredibly expensive. Ruins your reputation, it puts your family at danger. Several states are banning Chinese citizens from buying land, in their states, and like Texas is doing this, Florida is doing this. I think North Carolina is potentially doing this, but like this kind of policy is unprecedented. How clearly it's not friendly for immigrants if you cannot buy property as a citizen from a country that you're immigrating from. The mass shooting in Allen, Texas, the shooter was in their journals online. They were known for being neo-Nazis and having white supremacist beliefs, and clearly this person actively targeted an Asian family and murdered them in broad daylight. So what do you think is going to happen when the media keep ramping up its anti-China rhetoric in order to, manufacture consent for war? Like, we will be the ones to pay for it. Next slide. Okay. So what do we do? Clearly, this is very bleak. Okay, this is very bleak, and it seems like the entire world is kind of falling on. The sky's falling, and there's like nothing we can do. But I think, first of all, thank you everyone for being here and listening, right? Because this is one of those topics that is existential. Okay? It's existential and horrible and feels totally hopeless. But I do think that there are things that we as Chinese Americans and as leftists and socialists and community organizers can do to stop this. Whether you're Chinese American or not, it is in all of our best interests to redirect funds being sent to these defense contractors and towards communities, towards economic development, towards infrastructure, towards education, right? Like towards fighting climate change. Like these are all worthy uses of our tax dollars. And so, yeah, we should, I think like, we gotta call these people out. We gotta be aware. We gotta spread awareness. We gotta, tell our friends and family, like, hey, like, we need, like, having those hard conversations about this is not a good idea. Here's why, and here's what we can do. And I think a lot of this battle is one of like mental health and healing from trauma, right? I think amongst the Chinese American community, there's a lot of intergenerational trauma from the wars, the poverty, all the chaos that was happening that made our parents want to leave in the first place. So there's work to be done there in terms of healing and having those conversations and learning our history and trying to, backtrace and find our identity and our culture and healing all those things before we can start to tackle these like higher level issues associated with the military industrial complex and Washington, DC, and like the G7. Like these are all things that are important, but we need to like start with ourselves and look at ourselves and be kind to ourselves and find like give ourselves that space to just heal, so we can tackle these bigger issues. And yeah, I think I really think like this discussion about Chinese American politics needs to start with our families. And maybe some of you know or don't know, but a lot of these middle class and upper middle class Chinese American families are very tunnel visioned on wanting to achieve this kind of American dream. And that discussion needs to happen in the home, right? Like maybe the previous generation just doesn't want to listen and they're totally radicalized and they just want to go the way of Trump or Biden and just throw the entire country away, right? But one of the biggest challenges for me personally was how do I reconcile this with my own family? Like I know many Chinese Americans who struggle with parents who still believe in outdated beliefs about China and fall for American propaganda and don't think about like the broader context of like their existence and their choices. So being mindful of that is really important, I think. Next slide. So to me, what's happening is so crazy is because this is one, I feel like as a Chinese American, I have entered into the middle of this crazy story that has been happening for centuries. So this is a map of all the places that have been colonized by Europe or Japan, right? Since the 1500s. I'm from here. And I think many of us are from here. And what this tan and yellow color means is those are parts of the world that have never been colonized before, right? And so what happened in post-1965 is Chinese people from an uncolonized part of China flew into the heart of the empire, into the middle of a story that has been of slavery, of colonialism, of imperialism, of racism that has been happening for centuries, And we have no experience in understanding how to resolve this. It almost feels like we're like bystanders of acts of violence that are happening, and we have to make a choice. We have to make this crazy choice of which side are we going to be on. Are we going to enable the oppressors, or are we going to support the people who are being oppressed? that is really the choice as Chinese Americans that we have to make. The next slide. So another thing that I really want to shout out to is obviously Wei and the rest of the CODEPINK team. CODEPINK, we've been having weekly meeting or bi-weekly meetings called China's Not Our Enemy, where we discuss these kinds of issues. So I think starting with community is a positive first step. So thank you all for coming. You all clearly care, and this is impossible to do by yourself. And yeah, I mean, I would not be here without CODEPINK support. And so I think CODEPINK has a lot of great initiatives that we can use to organize and hopefully create some actionable change. Next one. So yeah, I mean, you're all very brave for coming here today and wanting to even discuss this topic, because I think the Chinese American community is very reluctant to want to talk about this. Very, very reluctant for multiple reasons, whether it's low literacy in English or low, less access to education through lack of privilege. But yeah, we really do have to make a choice of whether or not we're going to just ignore what happens and keep the status quo, even if it means going to war with China, or are we going to stand up and say something, or present a better way, right? So, the next slide. I wanted to bring up this case of Alexander Wang. Does anyone know who Alexander Wang is? So, Alexander Wang to me is like the Chinese American poster child. His parents were both, military scientists. They came on a specialized visa. He went to MIT. He won all these math competitions. He started a company, and he now is technically a billionaire and for starting a tech company. Now, his tech company is an AI company that does data labeling, and some of his clients are the CIA, the FBI, the Air Force, and the US Army. So he recently said in a tweet, "Our adversaries, Russia and China, are not going to pause because of regulation. If anything, they're going to use this as an opportunity to tighten their grip." And so clearly he's taken a side on the global stage about politics. Is this what we as Chinese Americans want? Is this really what we as a people should be striving for? To someday start a company that gets used by the military industrial complex to advance white supremacy and capitalism? Is this really what the goal is? Right? What's the point of taking all these math classes, entering all these competitions, taking all these science classes, going to MIT, if this is what the end goal is? Is this really the best that we can do? And to me, the answer is no. I don't think this is the right answer. And I'm saying this as someone who was also part of that tech world. I used to be in this startup tech world, and I felt like something was wrong here. Something was wrong here. There's no reason why I should be supporting all of these corporations that murder people for profit. That is not what I came here to do. Yeah, Alexander, if you're seeing this, let's talk, okay? Excellent. And so, this is what the world looks like to a lot of us, right? It's horrible. There are homeless people, who can't support themselves, children who can't feed themselves, child soldiers, parents who lose their parents to war. I want to go from this. I still believe that despite the world looking like this, that we as Chinese Americans and we as community organizers and progressives, we can go from this, next slide, to this. We can do this. We can do this. We just have to look at the situation and try to fix it. But we will never be able to get to this point if we don't actually look at the facts and address them. But we can do this. And this is why I'm doing this. This is why I'm speaking at, because life is too short to want to just, live a nihilistic life for profit. Okay, it's about people. It's about our families. It's about community. That's it. That's it. Excellent. Okay. Yeah. Drink the water. Sorry. Yeah, where's the water? Yeah, so that's kind of how I see it. And I've struggled for a very long time to find an audience who would even want to be having this discussion. And but yeah, what do you guys, I would love to hear from you guys, what you guys think, what this presentation made you think about, feedback, disagreements.
I really liked it. I mean, I wasn't expecting this kind of, I was always sort of boring. You know, it wasn't going to be personal. It wasn't going to be about people making decisions in their lives. You know, I thought it was going to be, oh, well, this is the gym political situation. So, no offense to CODEPINK. Yeah, I think it's an important presentation because it really I think it raises things about yeah. My family straddles that line, you know, with the thing. Poor, rich line. So I really hadn't thought about, wow, this is all the post 65 people in segment. Is there almost a consensus about how they're going to think? So that was one. I mean, I think getting specific like that's good for a lot of different reasons. I understand why a lot of Asian Americans don't want to bring that stuff up, because if you're progressive or on the left or something, it's like very petty bourgeois and kind of gross sometimes. But I think acknowledging is very important. Oh, well, no, it's my worse than that.
Despite there being a class divide, I think the Asian Americans and the Chinese Americans who have been here longer, the ones that I've met are a little bit more plugged in. And so these things aren't really like a surprise to them.
Yeah, it's not.
But yeah, the post 65 immigrants, they just got here. We just got here.
Yeah.
We didn't have the time to watch everything happen. Yeah. Connect the dots. So, but the timing is really poor because of, you know, the tensions.
What about, I hate to monopolize. I mean, does the strata of Chinese Americans, do they have experience of the 80s, or did it come after that, or what? Like, was in the 80s was all like Japan bashing? I don't know if they felt that.
Bashing
like the Vincent Chin murder, whatever, you know, like, at least in my experience, it's basically a lot of Nazis were killing Asian people around Orange County and up here and everything, and just harassment and like, you know, Nazis.
Well, so I think what happened in the 80s was that was the transition of power from like Mao to Deng, right? Like that's when Deng really started reeling in the power. And one way that he justified his policies was pointing at the West and Hong Kong and saying prosperity can only happen if you lax regulation. And so I think a lot of people from that generation grew up with this concept that free market capitalism is good, and West and Hong Kong, and you know, they are more advanced than us. And so even if these hate crimes were happening, the propaganda was coming from the top that capitalism is good. So I don't think they're really thinking about those kinds of things, unfortunately.
To adding on to your point, there actually was a short period in the late 80s when the fears of the Washington establishment was that essentially Japan would become where China is today, that Japan would develop its independent path away from the West, away from the US. It would stop being kind of this client of the US, which it had essentially been since after the end of World War II, and it will develop its own independent path. And this was the time, when you started to see this huge rise in Japanese automotives, during the late 80s. So that's when you started to kind of see the anti-Asian racism being directed towards Japanese people. But then that quickly changed, and Japan kind of became in this more subordinate position towards the US, and that radically changed, but there was, yes, a short period where the anti-Asian racism was directed towards the Japanese.
Yeah. I mean, that's why they went after Vincent Chin. They thought he was a Japanese auto worker. But yeah, unlike the 90s where the US was able to placate Japan through the Plaza Accord, there is no equivalent kind of policy for that. So, I mean, they would love to, but it's a different game with China for sure.
What's that called? Forgive me for not knowing the what accord?
The Plaza Accord.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it was. I think they forced Japan to devalue its currency, so basically make it like more advantageous for the U.S. to import its goods. Yeah, Japan is crazy. They've had a 0% interest rate for decades now, and they're. But yeah, it's a very different country with less people and different history. Yeah.
There's someone that put in the chat on the Zoom saying free market capitalism was the only thing for sale at that establishment. I think that was going back to when we saw the influx of Asian immigrants, like at the turn of like 70s, 80s. And I think that's very true, because now we see this rising tension with China is because that the US hegemony sees that China as a socialist country is providing an alternative to its a market capitalism for all of the countries with the Belt and Road initiatives in the global south, in Africa, in Latin America, saying that you don't have to follow the US's way in order to get to prosperity for your people. So yeah, that's why we see this rising tension towards China in recent years.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't even get to the part about the other countries, which is we're all stuck in the middle. Okay, like Europe is stuck in the middle. Africa is stuck in the middle. The Middle East is stuck in the middle. Everyone is kind of looking at both sides and being like, like, why would I go with Build Back Better if I can just have the Chinese build like this subway system? Yeah, I mean, Germany's struggling over this, right? Because China is one of like Germany's biggest export markets. So this is an issue that affects everybody, not just Americans. And so yeah, there is a little bit of a taking sides here. Like both countries have their problems. Obviously, the United States have their problems, but I'm not saying China is like the answer. But I think it's good that countries have an alternative developmental model than just the United States model. I think that's better for everybody. So, yes.
Yeah, I think the way that you approached it with your own personal background, like when we say China's American community, that means a lot of different things, because there's not a single community. I mean, there's like disparities, conditions, class, immigration pattern, lineages, generational existence within the confines of the United States. It's like, and shifts in the economy over time, and where your family has been part of it. It's very complicated. And like and it gets even worse when you start using terms like Asian American, because that's the conglomeration of all of this, because every nationality is really different. Very, very distinct.
Yeah, I learned the hard way about being specific, because I think my views happen to align with a lot of people who aren't second gens, but so they get very confused when I start talking about all these things about like PhD immigrants and like middle class and Kumon and the Ivy. They're just like, what are you talking about? Like, well, that's weird. So yeah, I think another course of action is maybe, the older generations and the different groups of Chinese people start talking to each other more, because there are bubbles. There are bubbles. Arcadia is like a giant bubble, right? Like that place is crazy. Yeah.
And just kind of respond to that from like my perspective as a campaigner with CODEPINK, leading up to having this event, we've actually been hearing different thoughts from like even within the Chinese American communities, people from different generations all sharing their perspective. Obviously, Hongyi and I are from like the younger generation, so we might know like elderly folks who are who came here because of the American dream that was sold to them, so they have like those ideas. And then we also have activists who are in like the older generation Chinese Americans, and then they were saying that the people who like the older generations, they still have some sort of like emotional attachment to the homeland, versus the younger generation who were born and raised there, they were just like raised in propaganda, and then they thought that it was actually younger generation being more likely to buy into war. So yeah, definitely we saw the different perspectives leading up to this. And again, just echoing what you said, really appreciate Hongyi sharing your experience with us, and then using that to lead this teaching.
Yeah, happy to. Class trader.
I don't
You
know.
don't have a job at Raytheon?
Not anymore. No, just kidding. Just sad time.
I'm wondering, like, I mean, what percentage of Chinese Americans do you think end up supporting the war or whatever? Job
Against China, or
yeah.
I think that's data that everyone is kind of wondering.
Feel like 10% or 50% or
I mean, it's 100% because we're all paying taxes in this country, and that's
What
what
I've heard is they just don't know. Even the people who, you know, are from Taiwan, who live in Taiwan, they just don't know. And one reason why I believe that's the case is because there's just low levels of English literacy amongst that generation, right? Like, it's hard enough to like read a New York Times article, nevertheless, you need through the motion. Right? So those critical reading skills are just not developed in a lot of people, I think. Because the content that we've covered today, right, requires context of the entire book. You have to like really literally start at 1500 or 92, right? You have to start there, go through the triangular trade, you have to go through the industrial revolutions, you got to go through like all the imperialism and colonialism to understand white supremacy, and then you can start talking about it. And that's just out of reach for most Chinese Americans because it's inaccessible. A-push is propaganda, right? AP US history and high school is propaganda.
yes.
Like one time I was like in class, they were talking about when they couped the Shah in the 50s or 60s. And I wanted to raise my hand and be like, are we gonna talk about that? But you know, like you're gonna bring up America is evil as like a second generation immigrant in school. Like, no, like you gotta get into Berkeley. Can't be humble in that fang bag.
You know, but in general, it's
Sorry.
I think in general, things like that happens out there. I mean, you know, like those things.
Right, well, you know, I think,
I
well,
tell you all the time. Should get mad at me.
I think a lot of things have changed, but you know, I mean, I think, especially like the Chinese American families, they don't really care about teaching history, right? Like, what do they care? They're just here to like, we are a migrant labor workforce. We're just here to we're just here to write the code and drink the boba. Like, that's where the term boba liberal comes from, right? Like, wanting to only talk about the surface level issues of like representation and, you know, stinky lunch and yeah, what was I say?
Really interesting. I guess I'm wondering, I mean, so there is that, that you're mentioning boba liberal. I'm wondering if I can, you know, say from my experience, I'm obviously not Chinese, I'm Mexican, but in our community, I think the barrier to political participation is like fear of being deported.
Oh,
And
yeah.
I'm wondering if that is also you think a concern, like especially for the 1965 generation.
Oh, yeah,
After that,
totally.
is that what's
Well, you know, they think these people believe the right wing or the American talking points of like, you know, authoritarian, you know, one party state and poverty has literally been growing at an exponential rate for like the past 2 decades. And yeah, there's fear. I think that might be changing now, especially as China's soft power starts, you know, increasing and people start thinking, hey, why am I bothering to support this regime? Like, but I think a lot of people like my age, we probably thought that of like, I gotta make it here because my parents sacrificed themselves to, you know, give me a better life. And it's like, well, maybe that wasn't the total truth. Like, maybe they just didn't read enough or weren't privileged to look at the big picture. I mean, that's a very common problem, right? Like, I think we count the number of Chinese Americans my age who majored at liberal arts on probably one hand. One hand. They're all in the CS department, which is fine, right? I wasn't there too. But
I think it's been about like an hour-ish since we began, and I don't know if you have like a time constraint, because we're okay.
okay.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Yes.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you both. And let's see, I stutter because just like you said, actually it's kind of traumatic, like, you know, think of the possibility of, say, for example, nuclear war, you know, so I don't even know exactly how this is going to turn out, like my little comments and or questions. But I can say that it's touched my heart in that I was raised when I was a kid with quite a few Chinese American friends and families, like with their parents. So it touches on something personal, and then just really briefly, I worked for the Chinese American Friendship Foundation, where I actually taught my version of, because I created the curriculum for me, not for the whole thing, just for my classes. It was about American style leadership and to Chinese students that were raised in that lived in China. And so they would only come to the United States to study and for a summer and then to go back. But anyway, my point here is just saying that actually is that so I would teach them American style leadership. I would teach them about leaders that they didn't know about, like people maybe on the left that so it was really interesting and exciting. And so my heart went out to the youth, to the kids, and like there was a personal connection again. So I guess so what I'm going to just saying is that again, I can't thank you enough because just the confusion and the possibility of war and is mentally traumatic, so and emotionally and one of the things amongst the many things that I like to say, but there's not enough time, so I can't say everything that I'm thinking here, but is one thing that I was really pleasantly totally shocked and surprised about is that you mentioned like things like, you know, we start with ourselves and our own mental health and be kind to ourselves. Like I didn't think we'd be talking about that. And as much as it might be seen as I was talking about from Martin earlier, like just lovey-dovey, you know, kumbaya, like peacenik, like whatever tree hugging thing. I mean, is that it's really, really fiercely, urgently true and necessary, I think, to take care of ourselves. And so where I'm getting to this is probably another reason why I've kind of had to stop and pause and think and ramble just a tiny bit is because I didn't think I'd be talking about this at all, but you mentioned it. So mental health is like, you know, oh, and also coupled with other huge wars like conflicts like Iraq and Russia, Ukraine, and this fear, like, and again, trauma, and yeah, fear, and then begging for solutions. I mean, like not begging, but this begs solutions, right? so I was actually, amongst this whole thing, is I'm gonna throw in here that I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. And so, and sometimes I get in a deep depression where it's hopelessness, where I feel like the woman I think that was burying her head in the sand, or sometimes I feel like that, like I'm doing that, and I'm isolating from everybody. And then for days, and then all of a sudden I decide to pop out of that and then become this, hopefully, maybe at times, super activist or involved in the community and doing things like this and showing up or helping lead a presentation. But anyway, so what's my point here is, one of the themes is thank you. And another thing is, I'm glad that you put the thing about mental health, and that starts with our families.
Oh, yeah.
And ourselves and healing. And then, so that gave me room to say, hey, you know what, I can self-identify, or I can identify or come out of the closet in terms of a lot of things. But in this case, mental health, with mental issues, having had a diagnosis. And so, so to wrap up, I don't know if it was gonna be a comment or a question, but I just like it how you gave us hope, and that's the reason I'm here too. When you show the communities together and working together and like a picture of children that were all different types of ethnicities and colors, is I believe that that we can, yeah, maybe that's why most of us are here, because we believe that I'll just say it like this: even though I think we're on the fast track to like annihilation of the planet, like as a humanity. However, I think, and I'm here because, and I do the presentation and everything because I believe that it's not too late, and that we can transform the planet. That we can
Absolutely. I 100% agree. So, yeah. Yeah, no, thank
Oh
you
yeah,
for
like you
sharing.
said, you ended up saying we can do this, and I wrote that down. We can do this.
Yeah, no, we can do this.
As
But
long as we continue to, work together, get each other's contact information and all that.
yeah, well, so no, thank you for that feedback, because the reason why I put it in there is because the Chinese American community, from my perspective, is going through like a mental health crisis. Okay, like the Asian American youth between like the ages of 18 and 24 are highest at risk for suicide in this
Dang.
country.
Wow.
If you look at all of the enclaves that have
Dang.
high Asian populations, they are suicide clusters.
Right.
In the Bay Area, in the East Coast, okay, you have all these first and second gen immigrants trying to shove all their kids into these STEM programs, and it's not healthy. And so I also read a lot about Asian Parent Stories, which is this online community for, Asian kids to, vent about their families, and it's a nightmare. It is a nightmare. And so, before we even start talking about this kind of stuff, I want all Chinese Americans and Asian Americans and just people in general to understand that, like, yes, like, I know this is a problem, but so is like your homophobic mom, or like
Right.
your dad who's like obsessed with like, who've been brainwashed, or your parents who are just so status obsessed and they can't stop bugging you about getting this job or going to this grad school, or like, because that's real. And yeah, I really do think this problem starts in the family, and that has to be fixed first before we can start talking about Northrop Grumman.
I think it also, to jump off of what you were saying, has a lot to do with, obviously you mentioned like our position, right, our positionality and all of it. And I mean, as a Latina, like I always think about how much this country was built off of Latinos, and that coupled with how we treat Latinos and the border. I work at the border, so I see this every single week. And I don't know, I really appreciated that you brought up the fact that it is a two-fold situation, right? Your community, and that our country is benefiting off of your, like, the intelligence and the skill set and the passion and the ambition of the community to use it against you, which is just, it can be shown in so many different cultures in America. So that just goes to show, like, can you imagine if all of us came together and we're like, yo, this is not right, right? But then like really like doing all of these things and for what? So, yeah, that I really resonated with that. So thank you for mentioning that, because I think a lot of people, they see maybe, you know, let's say, for example, a pride thing on TV, and they're like, well, that doesn't have anything to do with me, so why am I gonna show up? Why am I gonna fight for these people that I don't really, you know, whatever. When essentially it has everything to do with everything, right? And my family story has so many parallels to yours, right? So I think I really appreciate that you brought that up, because that echoes something that I already knew, but I didn't have the words to put to it. Yeah.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for sharing. The only reason I could put this presentation together is because I've learned from so many communities. So, yeah, it's good.
Yes, I'll be more brief this time, and that is that I just thought of this right now, while you were speaking, thank you for your contribution, and, as Chicano, and just someone raised in this country, in this part of this country, sometimes amongst the different sides of the border, but, just all of a sudden now just remembering somehow that I've definitely my experience has been that there's extreme amount of racism from the Latinos towards Asian American. I know I don't mean that, you know, not all together, but also from Asians toward Latinos, extreme sometimes, at times, like ingrained, like with propaganda, yeah, I mean, I studied, I did go to Berkeley, but I studied not STEM, but social justice. So with like social protest movements, and so it was the left scale of things. But anyway, a young woman, a fellow student who was in China, she asked me to tutor her in terms of English, and then later on she said, "Oh, I thought you were all like thieves," and because of what I see on TV in China.
It's propaganda.
Yeah, and you know, gangsters so what would you say, how would you build? I mean, this is one of the ways, right? This is part of the solution, the answer. Dang, and I said I'd be brief. So finally, I'm getting to finally is what do you think part of the solution is to bridge? I mean, do you also agree about this racism, and how do you think that relations between Latinos and Asians can be better? Chinese Americans or Chinese or Asian can be improved or transformed in our society right here.
Building solidarity.
Yeah. How do we build solidarity?
I mean, we're all colonized. For me, it's really looking at the history and looking at what happened before I existed and the way things are, and just deciding to push against that historical inertia instead of going along with it, right? Like, I just think about before I was born, there were like 108 billion people that existed here before my birth. We can only do so much to like change the way that history is going in our lifetime. But so, you know, I think it's just prioritizing learning about people instead of, you know, material safety, which is a privilege, right? That is a huge privilege. Like, not everyone has all this time to sit around to read about post-colonial theory. That is a huge privilege. And so I think if we do have that privilege, then we should use it to kind of educate people as much as possible and realize that it's okay to feel empathy for other people, even if it might mean you are a little less comfortable in it. Right? What year was that?
About what, Berkeley?
Or when you tutored that?
It was about it was already, God, it seems like a year ago, but it's been already about 10 years.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
That's normally the way I look at it, is in terms of like, we're all not only like honest people, but we're the working class, right? So, I mean, like I said earlier, if we all get together, like, there's no stopping.
More of these and soirees or something like social things.
Yeah, no, I mean, And they can't get rid of all of us. No go to work.
Yeah, add to like your observation about this, discrimination and prejudice amongst the people of color. I think it's just really important for us to realize that all of these tensions, like between different groups, the root is white supremacy, right? The Asian Americans, like we have this idea of like the model minority.
Sorry, it's all good. Hey, no. But I'm in that one too, so oh yeah.
White supremacy.
White supremacy and model minority myth, they came up with it back in the 70s when they saw the Black and brown people saying that they're struggling with stuff. They're saying, well, actually look at the Japanese, the Asians, they're doing just fine, and they're scapegoating Black and brown communities for their like issues instead of like addressing the systemic issues. And I actually just learned this a couple of months ago from a different CODEPINK webinar. Actually, we got like this scholar on the history of like Chinese Americans. And that day I learned that one of the worst lynchings that ever took place in the US took place here in Los Angeles in 1871. Where a mob of like 500 people murdered 18 Chinese Americans overnight. And that was you know, like during the post gold rush. So like again, going back to contract labor thing, and the mob that murdered all of these people actually was made up of white and Latino laborers.
Really?
So again, it's we have like all of these like things, but then really we see that it's really the white supremacists using one group to antagonize another, but really it's time for us, all people of color, to come together and then just as you said, show solidarity, and then we can just like address this issue. And we work for peace at CODEPINK, but we can have peace without justice.
Right.
And there was someone said in the chat earlier, racial oppression is not a byproduct of war, it's part of the underpinning and the methodology. So as we are trying to work for peace, we also need to address the justice, and we need to build solidarities of all oppressed people, and then we can work towards peace and justice.
So going back to that map, can we go back to that map? The one with the European colonialism. We as Chinese Americans are brand new to this stuff. Okay, like even having this discourse is like, it's like new, right? Sorry, go ahead.
I actually came up from like the northern part of China.
Oh, so you haven't followed.
Yeah, and-
Okay. So,
Yeah, not just by the Japanese though, but because like China also has the interesting history of like the 100 years of accumulation. So
yeah.
they like all we have like the European countries coming to China. They set up these what they call like concessions. Basically, they get to use this land and they do whatever they want, but they
Yeah.
still call it China. I was born in a city with a history of having concessions. Actually, we had concessions from 9 different countries.
Shandong,
No, Tianjin.
Tianjin. Okay,
Yeah.
Tianjin.
Yeah,
Sort of,
so yeah. So definitely, like growing up, I saw like all of these Western architectures. So just like, oh yeah, colonialism.
Well, yeah, well, I think like other minority groups in America have, you guys have a very long storied history of resistance and fighting against oppression, and we're brand new to this, right? Like, and white supremacy is trying to, you know, perform arbitrage on our ignorance, right? Like, it's almost like there's 2 camps. There's like the capitalists who say, hey, like, write this code for us. We'll like give you some stock options and money, or like that seems like really cool and sexy with like the free food bar and, you know, like the free food at Google, but you know, most Chinese people don't come here to understand the post-colonial history that's been happening for hundreds and hundreds of years. Like, so yeah, I think it starts with learning about our own histories, about how we were colonized, right? Like there's a big one big project that I have in life is trying to make the story about, you know, the Boston opium trade becoming more well known, right? Like it was highly disturbing to me. I grew up in Massachusetts, and it was crazy when I left to learn, wow, like all that racism that I experienced in that part of the country, all these institutions, are built on Chinese opium money. Like you go to Skid Row, right? You go to San Francisco, you go to any part of the inner city and you see all these, people on heroin and they look like zombies. That's what they were doing. That's what they were doing. And then they took that money, put it into Harvard, put it into a Master General Hospital, built up their institutions. Princeton University's biggest ever monetary donation was $2 million by a man named John Green. He was an opium trader. So it's crazy that the Ivy League that the Chinese Americans worship and idolize so much is literally built on Chinese blood. They're causing a public health crisis. Okay, like the fentanyl situation going now, horrible. Is it coming from China? Yes. Should it be happening? No. So why should it have happened centuries ago? And so, like, I think the more Chinese Americans start acknowledging that this land and this civilization was not just built on merit, okay, like the Chinese Americans are like obsessed with merit and they think everyone plays as fairly as they do. Like, no, it has not been like that, and it has never been like that. And so, yeah, I think in order to get the Chinese Americans to start listening, they gotta start learning about themselves, okay? And then they gotta start learning about other people. And once we do, like, it's gonna be a very different ball game. Because who's gonna go to Facebook, guys? Like, who's gonna rent the code? Like, no one. Chinese Americans play a very important role in the American economy. Very important. And yeah, so.
Yeah. I wanted to say one thing and man. So one thing that's funny is Stanford was one of the anti-Chinese government that wanted to pick Chinese out of California. So anyways, yeah, so the other thing I was trying to burn the bottom line was in the 70s, and it does connect to empire, because in the 50s, right, the Japanese Americans were coming out of the concentration camp, and basically everybody hated Japanese Americans, just hated them, like, because they were primed to hate us because of the war, right? So they had to kind of undo that, and they came up with this idea, oh, these are modern minorities, they're very peaceful, and it's also at the same time, the Japanese occupation was happening and then winding down. And so they needed to also create an image of Japan as part of the American empire, right? Because right as at the end of World War II, China, which had been an ally, is instantly and Japan, which had been the enemy aligned with fascism, was instantly part of America, basically. And so they had to flip it all around. And I think that was one of the propaganda techniques. Right? They had to also reintegrate all these people who were in, like, basically a prison back into society. Like, it doesn't make us look. Yeah. So it's pretty wild to be thinking of it. Yeah, there you go. Model integration.
Yeah.
And if you bought into that, right, like somebody that's working at maybe on the food court and all that stuff at people or whatever, right? So what you had to pay, the price was higher. You had to turn your back on your parents who worked in Japan, right? You had to give all of your kids, not Japanese names, so more like you were given. You have to give them European names, right? And again, these concessions you had to make in order to be reaccepted in society, and stave off racist violence. Like the Moss family went to Cleveland, and they told everybody in Cleveland they were Chinese after the concentration. And so there was a lot of that kind of psychological stuff that we're never going to become. I'll tell you right now, we're the slowest growing population. So let Japanese Americans be a warning for what's going on right now with the China passion, because this society will put you away as the primary scapegoat. They always change the scapegoat. Today, Chinese, yesterday, Japanese, before Mexicans, right? They switch it up. So, but if we look at history, we have to understand the seriousness of the situation. And it is very wide in scope, because it's not just about China. They start out with trans people, lesbians, gays. Dehumanization of one is dehumanization of us all, and people don't get that, like you were saying, right? And we have to get to the point, like you said, studying history and commonalities across different colonized people. And that's the trick. I mean, that's the only thing they have on us is cash. They don't have the numbers. The only thing they have holding over us is the mental state.
Well, I think it's possible because it's easier than ever in some ways. Like, what are these phones for? What are these computers for? Like talking to each other, right? Like, this webinar would not be possible like 5-10 years ago. And so you don't have to go to the library every day, you know, you can just go online and just do your research. And so that's why I believe it's possible, because the world that we have today is only possible because of like the limits that we had from before, but those limits aren't there anymore. So why not try? Why do we need to act like we're all in the 80s again? Like, we don't. We don't need to. It's not that serious. Like, okay. Yes.
Well, first of all, I really want to thank you, and I want to thank Wang and everyone who organized this. You know, one thing that I think was very, you know, that I really appreciated from your presentation was the honesty and the, you know, the authenticity of what they were saying, and also this need for, I think, a community, you know, that we cannot do this work if we do not have a community. The world of social media, I think, has kind of isolated us, you know, a bit, you know, and I think it was very nice, you know, it's very nice being a part of the CNO team and CODEPINK. You know, I feel that there is a community, but I think, you know, actually meeting you guys in person, having this space is so much more powerful, because it's like we get to see that we're actually like real human beings, as opposed to on a screen. Like, since it was really nice, half a year ago, 6 months ago, meeting Jody for the first time, you know. Yeah, Jody Evans at the Cuba event that I went with.
Everyone join.
Yeah, please join. But another thing that you said, which you know, really resonated with me, was this sense of anxiety and loneliness, because, you know, I feel this like all the time, you know, and I have to confess that this has been a great source of my depression. Like Gus, I battled depression. You know, I've been battling depression since I was in college and in high school, and this is a major source of it. And it's not so much, okay, you know, because of what our leaders and warmongers are doing, but it's due to the alienation caused by this, that it's so difficult to talk to people about this. You know, it's so hard, you know, and it's you know, like I come off as a Debbie Downer, you know, as
You're ruining it. You're ruining it. Come on, let's go get boba. Like, why are you? Come on.
Like, yeah, you know, like that image that you showed of 99 Ranch, you know, the boba, like, that's basically my world. You know, my girlfriend is, you know, my family's very international. My girlfriend's Filipina, you know, I have Chinese Americans in my family, so yeah, you know, like I'm exposed to all of this, you know, going out, you know, the foodie culture, then boba, then going to 99 Ranch, and then I bring up the geopolitical stuff. It's like, Martin, why'd you ruin it? Why'd you kill it?
No, it's interesting because you are Chinese American, but you understand like the nihilistic kind of outlook that a lot of these families have, right? And it's understandable, like thousands of years of like, you know, like dynastic rule, right? Like China is famous for having very, very strong states. Okay, like if there's one thing about China is that we we had literally thousands of warring kingdoms that we whittled down through violence and blah, 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 until everyone was obedient. So yeah, there's a tendency for us to not want to rock the boat by saying like, maybe we shouldn't build missiles for Raytheon to fire at Palestinian children. But yeah, it's the word. It is very depressing.
For the community homes.
Yeah, well, the community doesn't really exist yet until now.
I'm saying this
community. Yeah,
yeah.
The community exists. We're trying to get that community going. I mean, I made this presentation because I was like, I don't know who else wants. Like, I can't find. Like, I'm trying to find all you guys. Like, let's do something.
Yeah, we're here.
So, I mean, now we have a small little army. Let's
Not army, no, not army.
Okay, sorry.
Cadre.
Camaraderie.
Camaraderie, yes.
Family.
Yes, family, I love that.
Sure.
One other thing that I wanted to mention is this idea, I think, which I kind of think, that we're kind of getting to, as far as talking about how communities here, have been turned against each other, different colonized and oppressed people have been turned against each other. And that's why I keep, trying to remind people this idea about internationalism. And how if you look at if you look at the history of modern China, during the revolution, it was a very powerful force within building internationalism, between building anti-colonial movements. I posted a video onto our email group where these African leftists are talking about how right after the Chinese Revolution, 1965. When China's GDP was essentially like sub-Saharan Africa, they helped build rail systems throughout Africa, throughout Zambia.
In Zambia,
And the one in Zambia, 65 Chinese workers died in the construction of this project. So this is something I think that, as people, who are colonized, people of color, but also leftists, need to be reminded of that China is a great comrade, historical great comrade in our struggle. And unfortunately, it's not. I know this because I'm a school teacher. If I were to teach this, I'd probably lose my job.
Oh yeah, you're out of there. You're out of
Gotta
there.
get the kids to Ivy League and Berkeley.
Yeah, it's not going to help with that.
Yeah, I mean, if these Chinese Americans really wanted to get their kids in the Ivy League, they would just tell them to write, a sob story about like political persecution, how one party system. They're like, oh, perfect, we found our figurehead. And that's a very common thing, right? Like Chinese Americans working for Western media and saying, I'm Chinese, listen to me. And it's like, no. So yeah, they're always trying to pull the tricks.
Okay, in the spirit of community and getting together on a political and social basis, like so I started this couple groups. One is called Upward, and Martin's been a huge part of that. And I know it was called World Peace Now. And the way I see this, it's a fledgling movement having to do with creating peace and with social justice and equity. So we've had our what I call our special event meetings. So they're really meetings, but they have a flavor of a tiny bit of like even celebration. Like there's been music, like live music within the meeting, and like food and everything in the meeting. So there's a social aspect of it, definitely. But I guess this is like again, in the spirit of creating community and continuing with that, I wanted to invite people to too bad I didn't think of it, so I didn't have a flyer or anything, but people would come up to me. We're in Pomona, we would meet Mona, but we can meet in the future in other places like here. And we meet actually at a bookstore called an amazing nonprofit bookstore called Cultural Center called Café con Libros in Pomona. And a few seconds of shameless advertising, the day and the time.
Sure,
Yeah,
go ahead, yeah.
okay, and that's May 20th, which is Saturday. And again, I'll repeat it, May 20th, which is Saturday, about 2.5 weeks from today, is our next special event meeting. And oh, June 20th, June 17th. Oh, yeah, I said that all wrong. That was our last meeting. So it's June 17th, Saturday at 4:30 p.m. at Café con Libros in the Artistic District of Pomona. And I'll just read it one last time to make sure everyone has it right. That's Saturday, June 17th at 4:30 at Café con Libros. But come up to me if you want more information, or need to write down the address and things like that. You can Google Café con Libros. To continue the spirit of like Chinese, Chicano, Asian, Latino, Latina solidarity.
Yeah.
The touch of fun.
Yeah, no, I think, yeah, the fun part is important. I think we had a CODEPINK meeting, there's like, does anyone have any ideas to how we can get the message out? I'm like, music festival?
Like rave?
Rave? Anti-imperialist rave?
Anti-imperialist Burning Man.
Yeah, I mean, that's what you're starting for.
That was the original message of it.
Guys, we need to start a music fest. That's how we can.
Yeah.
And only the cool anti-imperialist people can come.
Are we gonna vet them?
Well, if you're anti-imperialist, you're automatically cool.
Yeah, you know, I mean, yeah, we can go to Laurel Canyon and like take over, like. Just kidding.
Go to the Salton Sea.
I mean, this is counterculture, right? This is literally counterculture. There's a very long history of counterculture, and I think while we're young, let's do something rebellious and what we think is right. And
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, thank you all so much. Yeah, my God. CODEPINK, shout out CODEPINK. I think
we
go
have
to the
a,
last slide. Basically, we have some petitions, so you can sign our petition.
we have some petitions. You can find all of them on codepink.org or codepink.org/China. It's like the website for our campaign, and you can find all of like China related petitions there. And are we still trying to share some? Okay.
Sorry, the one before. Yeah, we have these petitions.
Yeah, so now that we feel so energized after these excellent presentation, why don't we take an action right now? So shameless plug for CODEPINK. One of our ongoing actions is to basically tell Congress to stand for peace and cooperation with China. This year, at the beginning of this year in January, we saw that the Congress established a House Select Committee focusing on competition with China. This is the first time in U.S. history a Congress has ever created a committee focusing on competition with another country. So, and we know this is also driving hate towards the Asian American community. So I know y'all have phones and then y'all are on the computer. So go to codepink.org/CongressChina23. So if you put in some information right here, this system is going to automatically find who your representative is and who your senators are. And we already have like a template, a letter written for you. You can feel free to edit it or just go ahead and send it. Basically, it talks about the importance of with peace with China, especially now we're talking about the Chinese American or Asian American community. We know if you've heard about the Stop API Hate, the database, they've been collecting incidents of hate crime towards our community members since 2020. And so far they've received over 11,000 reports of hate incidents. And actually 1 in 5 of these reports, the perpetrator would say something that we see the warmongers use as part of their political rhetoric, blaming our community members for COVID-19, blaming them for espionage, blaming them for economic insecurities. So this war on China is also driving hate. And as someone mentioned earlier, like racism is part of this war, and this war is fueling racism altogether. So yeah, really appreciate y'all for being here. And again, go to codepink.org/China. You can find all of our petitions on there. Yeah, thank you all so much for coming. And thank you to Gabe for sitting with us.
Real quick flag, we started a new subreddit, called R Progressive Asians. And we're trying to use that to like collect, news topics, articles, research, links and things like that, to try to alternative to Musk take over Twitter and all kinds of other crap that's not very progressive on Reddit. So if everybody could join that, it's really easy to post it on a WordPress site if you have one as an RSS feed, but that's it. Thank you.
We have an open mic on Friday.
Oh, yeah.
For Pride. Yeah.
Is that like poetry and spoken word or?
You
also?
could go up there and rant about this topic if you want.
What?
No, but yeah,
It's not poetry.
yeah.
What time?
It starts at 8 p.m.
8 p.m. On this Friday?
Some food and drinks.
I guess, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I know you guys, we're all doing an action at purpose that we need, so it's great. And like, they're looking forward to it. So what's some of the other events coming up in the city? We talk about China's not an enemy and just one journal.
Mhm.
So like, what's the next one coming up?
Yeah, next one coming up is actually going to be this coming Monday. Our co-founder of CODEPINK and also who created this campaign, Jody Evans, you probably heard of her. She's really awesome. She's currently on a trip to China. And she's coming back in a few days, and then this coming Monday, June 4th, maybe check the calendar to make sure I have the right date. At 4 p.m. Pacific time, since we're just all here in California. We're going to be on Zoom, and Jody's going to share about her experience in China, what she's learned, what she's seen, what she's witnessed, and everything. That's going to be our next webinar. We are also planning some more actions coming up for June, is that we are going to be in DC and talk to the committee that we mentioned. It is a McCarthyist committee. Driving hate, like driving this new Cold War on China. So we are going to do teach-ins for the committee members. We're going to deliver all the petitions that we currently have on our website. So if you sign one of our petitions, we guarantee that we will physically deliver these petitions to our Congress members. And we're going to teach them all about China because the weapon industry, like everyone's talking about war, what they need to hear is voices for peace. So yeah, if you could join us in DC, that would be really awesome. But it's far, but it's far.
Cool. All right.
And yeah.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.